Hey friends, welcome to Holy Ourselves, a podcast about becoming more authentic in our faith, especially in relationship to our sexuality and our gender, as we figure out what it means to be whole before God, ourselves, and others in the midst of this crazy world. I know this podcast is coming a little bit later than usual because it should have been out last Monday, but it is a week late. And that is because I have been traveling over the last month. I got to go to Hawaii to see a friend, had amazing experiences, which I talked about in this past month's Substack newsletter, and then went to Ohio, got to spend time with a church, talking with them about LGBT care and formation, doing a training, which I always love doing, and then actually went to the Side B retreat, which was really cool, and then on to Chicago to visit some friends, got to see snow, which as a Floridian, rarely ever get to see, so that was great. And so the episode is coming to you just a week later. I got into town not last Friday, the Friday before last. And it has just been a whirlwind trying to catch up on everything. A lot happens in a month. So we are pushing through, and I appreciate you all, your grace and your understanding. I really want to be consistent about these episodes. And so this is not going to be usual, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to get it out last Monday. So I thought, you know what, we'll just wait. It's not the end of the world. Here we are. So this is episode 11, and I am alone today. If you are on YouTube, you will notice that there is no video. That is because I'm working on transitioning to a new podcasting space, but I am currently between spaces right now. And rather than waiting for things to be set up or kind of it being a little bit chaotic, I wanted to get this episode out to you now already since it's late. So it's just going to be audio today. And the next time you see me on video will be in the new year, in the new space. So really excited for that. And it'll be better. You know, podcasting is a learning experience for me constantly. I remember when I barely could figure out how to connect the microphone or publish an episode, and that part has come far, and now I'm trying to figure out the video side of things. And who knows? We'll see if it sticks. Ultimately, podcasting is audio, and I really don't care about trends. So if I end up not liking video, if you guys don't end up liking video, I won't do it. But I'm giving it a try, pushing myself. So now, this does not mean that there is no more content for the rest of the year. Just because, the next time you'll see me on video is next year. If you listen to the last episode I did with Sarah, Claire, and Adam, you heard me talk about my plans. But for those of you who did not listen, which you should go back and do so, that was an amazing episode. But after today's episode, I will be sharing recordings from talks and sermons I've given over the past year. I will also be putting out my regular monthly bonus episodes on Patreon, which patrons, this month's bonus episode will be coming out soon after this. I promise. Like I said, I'm just catching up from being out of town. And then I will be doing my quarterly bonus interview on the Patreon page in December with a special guest. Last time I did an extra interview with Timon Lee talking about celibate partnerships and the research he had done on that. So once that is out, I will share more details in the introductions of the episodes coming out over the next month and a half. And I'm really excited for the talks and sermons that I'm going to be sharing over in December, because it's both helpful for me because then it's less episodes to plan, but also between preaching at my church and some other talks I do, I get to do a lot of these talks and want to share some of my favorites from over the past year with you guys. So I'm interested to see what you guys think. So after all of that, in the new year, there will be a new season of the podcast with, like I said, a new studio, new episodes, new interviews. There are some really exciting conversations being lined up for 2026. Ones I have been desiring to have my entire podcasting career. So really excited for those. Patrons, be on the lookout for some of those details very soon. For today, I want to talk with you all about what it means to be in process when it comes to our sexuality and spiritual formation. During my travels, I kept coming back to this idea of integrity, especially honest integrity without pretending. So, you know, over the past month as I was traveling, I was having a lot of conversations with people about the idea of growing, about spiritually growing. We're all on a journey of growing. And I think we all accept that. We accept it in our careers, in our relationships, and grief. And I think in general, sanctification, if you get in theological terms, the whole idea is sanctification is this growth process that every person is on who follows Jesus. But when we talk about sexuality, we struggle with this idea of being in process or growing. Like, what I mean by this is the idea that we can have convictions and standards and yet also accept that we ourselves and others don't meet those standards. I feel like we lean towards these extremes, leaning towards like rigid policing, telling people you got to meet these standards. And if you don't meet those standards, then, shame on you. And the other extreme is just sweeping approval. Just everything is fine to do. And it's not just like, oh, people are messy, people are growing. The idea is all of it goes. So there's these two extremes, and with little in the middle. And most of us, I would say, don't actually live in those extremes. They're extremes because they're extremes. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, but often we feel the tension of these two extremes. If you don't feel the tension of, I'm sure many of you are like, yes, I feel the tension of that. And so to be compassionate and accept someone as they are, you have to believe that anything goes when it comes to sexuality. That's the extreme. That if I'm going to be compassionate, if I'm going to accept someone as they are, I have to believe that whatever they're doing is morally good. And then on the opposite side, to have a standard, to hold a standard, you have to be harsh and you have to require compliance with that standard. And I think that there's also some aspects in between there, within that, of we feel uncomfortable with when people do not meet our standards because it brings up a lot of shame within our own lives. It brings up we feel unstable in our own lives because the standards give us safety. And so there's a lot of internal tension that comes up for that. So I've been thinking about these two extremes and the fact that we can accept the complexity of all of this within so many parts of our lives. Why don't we allow this why don't we allow this processing, this avenue for growth in sexuality? Because I want to hold to standards of what we are called into with our sexuality, but I also just don't think it's helpful for rigidity, and it needs to allow for people to be in the space that they're in. So as I've been sitting with this, I've been thinking about, why do we not allow this for sexuality? And the first one I'm kind of hinted to earlier is sexuality is loaded with shame. Shame makes us demand instant clarity from others because ambiguity makes us feel anxious. We find safety in standards, in compliance, in rigidity, because then we don't have to deal with the inner turmoil. We don't have to deal with the ambiguity. If I don't know exactly where someone lands sexually, I feel unsafe. That's like the general idea of the shame. But this is not exactly how we treat other areas of our lives. And I think that comes to another point. So like sexuality is loaded with shame. And why is it loaded with shame? It's because sexuality reveals a very vulnerable part of our lives. Sexuality touches on identity, desire, like our very bodies. It's where our fears about holiness and about worth and dignity begin to surface. And so when you're dealing with something so personal, so vulnerable, naturally it is very susceptible to shame. And then because of that, sexuality is moralized differently. So often in the church especially, sexuality is categorized by purity. not so much a category of formation. We don't treat greed and gluttony and gossip or self-righteousness with that same rigidity that we do sexuality. And I think it's because the way that we moralize it is based on these categories of purity. Now, I would say from the other side, there are other ways that, especially in culture, sexuality will be moralized by justice or by freedom, by all of these things. I like to do it in a format of formation, just a clear understanding of where the person is at in their lives and being able to understand how we go from there. But we're going to get into that a little bit more. So we use these standards of purity that to hold these standards, you are purer, you are cleaner, you are more holy. This gets symbolized in our culture in some ways, such as a bride wearing white on her wedding day, which, shocker for anyone who doesn't know the history, goes back to the queens of England. It does not go back to any actual spiritual or moral or biblical standard. This is a very new Victorian age standard that we symbolize the bride in white to somehow say that she's a virgin, which makes her more desirable, more dignified, more clean. And that if you don't follow these rigid standards, you are dirty, you are disgusting, you lose your worth. We've all seen, if you grew up as a kid in youth group in purity culture, you understand the examples of roses that are being touched and the petals are crumbled, and then people ask, who wants this after it's been touched so many times? Or the gum that's been chewed, which is one of the most disgusting examples the youth group ever did. Why does youth group have to use so many disgusting examples? But we use these because it's based on purity. We connect someone's ability to hold to standards of actions, of behavior, as signifying their worth and their cleanliness. And this gets really messed up in church. We've all seen it. The scandals that all of this creates is extreme. Christian leadership is just filled with sexual scandal. And you can't isolate it to one denomination or group. It's very widespread. You know, you have the major scandals of the Catholic Church, which is something even beyond just a sexual scandal. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But just in general, the affairs of pastors, the abuse of pastors, all of these different aspects. And I think that there's an irony in it that needs to be, explored. So one example is the case of Jerry Falwell Jr. and his wife. Jerry Falwell Jr., who was the president of Liberty University, he followed in the footsteps of his father, Jerry Falwell Sr., who created the moral majority in the United States and was very rigid in how he talked about family values and traditional values, and really attacking and villainizing anyone that disagreed with him or lived differently. And his wife also was on this whole bandwagon. They would come after LGBT people. They would come after politically progressive individuals as their enemy and trying to destroy the family, which they saw in this very rigid model. And again, it's not even the model that they had, but it was the understanding that if you do not fit into this, you've lost your dignity and you're actually a villain. You are an enemy. What's ironic is that then it surfaces that while they held this judgmental view of others who lived differently than them, disagreed with them, their lives were very far out of the structure that they promoted. There came out a guy that they were in an interesting sexual triangle with. And I truly believe, so hear me on this, I truly believe that when we see people being highly critical and very loudly judgmental of others, especially on the topics of sexuality, it almost always is an indication that that person's life is far below the standards that they are speaking on, because it is easier to point at others rather than examine your own life. I promise you, this happens all the time. When I see people who are going after it, going, why are you not living in this way? And all of those kinds of aspects. When it comes to sexuality, it is usually a smokescreen. We see this in male pastors who make out women to be the villains of their sexual purity. They go after how women dress and how women go after men. This is a trope as long, it's gone on forever, but men will point at women as the problem because they don't want to look at their own heart. They don't want to have to look at their own issues within their own life. The irony is, I always love how they point to somehow the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says that if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've already committed adultery with her in her own heart, and somehow turn that on women. Because it's like, women, don't you want to help your brothers not stumble? Well, Jesus never said anything about the woman. He did not care about how the woman was dressed. He didn't care about any of that because those standards were already really highly on women at the time. Jesus is saying, it's not the woman, it's you. It's what's going on in your heart that is happening. He's literally talking about this reflective part. Rather than focusing on her, you need to focus on your own heart and what's going on. I mean, it's the log and the speck in the eyes. Jesus is saying, before you deal with the speck in their eye, because at least they're being honest about how they're living, you need to deal with the log in your own. So queer people also know this standard of the fact that when you see people highly judgmental and highly critical on sexuality issues, that it normally is an indication of something going on in their own lives. Queer people know this because usually the loudest homophobes are queer themselves and stuck in deep shame. This is a constant thing that happens. We've seen this from even when it was revealed that the shooter of the Pulse nightclub shooting had actually visited Pulse multiple times before, and it seemed like there was evidence that he had encounters with men himself. So we see this with sometimes even some of politicians who are usually very, very anti-LGBT rights actually will end up in gay scandals themselves. It's a very consistent theme. And I promise you, if you look and you see the people who go after LGBT people or who hold up purity culture standards really, really highly, again, it's not that they have these standards. That's not the problem. It's that they are villainizing others and they are judging those who can't meet that standard or don't agree with that standard. Those people are not able to look themselves in the mirror related to their own hearts. And one of the things that I've found to be a problem is that churches have a very hard time to create space for honesty in the small things. And when we can't have honesty in the small things, our desires, our own sexuality can grow to be very monstrous. It is not helpful when we take people out of positions, leadership, volunteer positions for issues like porn use or simply having sex outside of marriage. And we're going to talk about power dynamics and some of these things, abuse, in a moment. But I really want to first focus on the fact that when we communicate that you cannot talk about porn use, you cannot talk about your sexual activity that is not following the standards of your church community, then we are pushing people to hide. And I truly believe that is the avenue that takes things that are simple, that takes troubles that are normal, and creates them into monsters. And so let's talk about the aspect of power, because that's where some of these things get really complex in between compassion and accountability. So one aspect that does make sexuality very complex, very interestingly complex, is the context of power within sex and sexuality. I don't know, some of you may have heard that Oscar Wilde is attributed to have quoted that everything in life is about sex except for sex. Sex is about power. And sadly, most church scandals aren't situations of simply having sex outside of marriage or looking at porn. Most of the scandals that we see on the news around sexuality have nothing to do with that. Like the Catholic Church priest scandals is usually with children, which is a whole nother level. But even when pastors are having affairs with women, because usually it is the male pastors. I'm just going to make that assumption. It normally happens with male pastors that they will have affairs with women in their church. That is not simply an affair. That is an abuse of power. Why? Because you are in a leadership position over this woman. You are in a context in which you're not equals. You're not on the same level. And it's sad that sometimes these will get morphed into, oh, he just had an affair. And in some ways, maybe yes. But when it is a person who is part of your congregation and you are the pastor, you are no longer simply having an affair. That is an abuse of power. And there has to be accountability for that. Abuse of power cannot be overlooked and must require removal from someone's position. Many times, I think it's reporting to the authority. Most of the time, it's reporting to the authorities. And I want to refer back to the episode I did with Emily Blaylock on sexual violence and the church, and we talked a lot about these things. That is a whole different aspect of it, and go back and listen to that episode if you haven't. What's really sad is that the church has gotten this twisted somehow, and it's so crazy because I am constantly walking alongside LGBT people who are removed from their positions in a church because they kissed someone of the same sex or they looked at porn, something so innocent that they should be able to talk about, no matter where your church is at on same-sex sexuality or LGBT sexualities. Even if you are a side B church, a church that holds to a traditional view of marriage, there needs to be space for LGBT people in your church, especially if they're in a leadership role, to talk about the struggles of their life. Like if you're calling someone to celibacy, because that's going to be the standard unless they're going to get in an opposite sex marriage, you have to be able to allow them to talk about trying to move towards celibacy. So we hold these super high standards on this realm, but then we forgive a pastor who has abused a church member in an affair and maybe we fire him, but then we don't report it to the police when it's sexual abuse because we don't want to ruin the life of this pastor. And that is so sad. How are we being so rigid with this gay person, with, for instance, maybe an opposite sex straight teenagers who are having sex before marriage? We ridicule them and we shame them. But then over here, we're taking some forms of maybe accountability in the forms of abuse, but then we don't report to the police. We don't actually take the steps that are needed. And what is sad is that I believe in most of these situations where leadership has abused power in sexual relationships, it can be tracked back in their own lives to the shame and the hiding of the pastor at the deepest parts of their heart. Like this is what Sarah Claire, Adam, and I were talking about in the last episode. We have to do the internal work. I don't think pastors, unless it's like literally something psychological going on of, an actual case of real narcissism, not social media narcissism. And there is a difference. Maybe we need to talk about that sometime. But unless it's some kind of case in like that, most of these situations where pastors are abusing power, it comes back to them not doing their own work of their heart when it was porn use or stress or the shame that's going on of how they aren't living the life that they feel that they're supposed to, and the shame that comes up with that. And when they don't have the space to be honest because of the pressure that is on pastors, that really is like you have to live the perfect life. You can't make a mistake. If you make a mistake, you're going to be taken out of your position. So when you are being unfaithful to your spouse, when you are, if you're celibate, not actually living that out, whether it's fidelity, whether it's pure, abstinence, whatever the standard is, and you're not living that, and you don't feel you have a place to talk about it, that just grows. The shame grows, and it will come out sideways somewhere. And it is so rampant in our churches because we don't have a place for honesty in the small things. We don't have a place where a pastor can talk about the fact that he or she is struggling with aspects of their sexuality and how to live that out in relationship with their convictions. And so this brings me back to the word integrity. And integrity while growing, because we need an honest integrity when it comes to sexuality. But with integrity, we usually think of being perfect. And I really want to dispel that myth. Integrity does not mean performative morality. You don't have to present yourself as already arrived. That's what we think of with integrity. To have integrity, I only speak on issues that I already have figured out. And then therefore we need to talk on everything. So then we have to pretend that we have everything figured out. That is not integrity. Integrity is also not meaning that you have to explain everything to everyone, because this is another form of integrity. Because we have the one of performative, of perfection. And I definitely, when I was trying to figure out what integrity looked like in my own life, I went to the other extreme of going, okay, to have integrity means I'm going to be saying everything to everyone. But I quickly learned I don't owe the internet a progress report. I think we can be honest without owing something to everyone. And I think many queer Christians feel the burden to announce or clarify exactly where they are sexually because others demand certainty. They want to know, are you really living this conviction? Are you doing it in this way? And we feel I see this with side B Christians all the time, of going into a church and having to clarify, well, yes, I'm queer, but I'm celibate. And it's like, does that random person need to know this? Are they owed that? This forces premature decisions, premature labels, and premature theological commitments. Because then we are being stuck in a box that doesn't actually feel connected to who we are internally. And so that's where I will usually say integrity is connected to when we present ourselves in alignment with who we are internally. So a way that I will often check integrity in my own life is I don't have to tell them every detail of my life. I don't have to, anytime I speak, like in this world, I don't have to speak on everything in my life. You don't need to know every single area that I struggle with or don't struggle with, but I'm always asking myself, the way that people in the world understand me versus my closest friends versus my own heart, if any of these groups were to learn more, would that completely destroy the person they understand me to be? Sure, it might be shocking because it was like, oh, didn't know that about you, something of those things. But would it completely destroy the image that they have of me based on the information they have now? And so that has always been, for instance, going back to the Falwells, to learn about their sexual experiences with other people, inviting people into their relationship and the experiences that they had, that destroyed the view that people had of them based on the standards that they were promoting, based on the judgment by which they promoted those standards. It completely shifted how people saw them. That is a lack of integrity. But when we can come at it and be like, hey, so I'm going to share, when we can be honest about maybe that we are always growing. Early on in my journey with celibacy, I stopped using the phrase, oh, I'm celibate, and I started using the phrase, I am pursuing celibacy. Because I learned very quickly in my shift of pursuing celibacy that I wasn't good at it. Early on, I had really, really struggled with it. And then I had gone through cycles of like different things coming up and that like creating internal struggle. And so to say I was celibate didn't feel like it had integrity. But to say I'm pursuing celibacy is to say I am growing in something, is to say I am moving towards a goal. And that felt much more integrated. That felt much more full. I'm not saying that's what other people need to use, but that was what was helpful for me. So that in those moments when I was sexually active, I felt like if I had told people in my life, and when I did tell people in my life, it wasn't this shocker of, wow, we don't even know who you are. It was gaining new information, but it was helping them to know me even deeper of who I was and me inviting them into a piece of my heart that I was trying to figure out, like what was leading me to be, to have sex in those contexts and such. So that allowed me then to actually build integrity in a way that still held my standards of where I desired to go, but invited people into the process and the messiness of it. And that's been something that has been so transformative in my life, because it has allowed me to then actually address the parts of my heart that always felt like I had to hide them. And one phrase that someone once shared with me that I found really helpful in dispelling these like perceptions we have about integrity, that you need to perform well, or you need to, have the appearance, of all of these things, was if God worried about appearances, especially sexually, seems he would have chosen a different avenue of bringing Jesus into the world than through an unmarried teenager. Because if you think about it, like perception-wise, God completely destroys these standards of sexual purity when he has Jesus conceived through Mary as a teenager who, yes, is engaged, but not married. Like, it's the scandal of Jesus's birth that this is the context in which he comes in. And so if God is fine in that situation, I don't believe God is as concerned about our outward appearance of perfection or performative morality. God is more concerned with our heart. God is more concerned with consistency and really knowing us at our core selves, and where the scary things about our life and the dark things about our life and the beautiful things about our life. It really shows, some of you guys have probably heard this phrase before, of the holiness of Jesus being invasive rather than evasive. We so often have traditionally understood holiness of God as being avoidance, of pretending, of running away. The moment there is messiness, the moment that there is anything uncleanliness, as in the Torah, that holiness runs. It has to stay far away from messiness. But that is not the way that Jesus' holiness actually acts. Jesus is in contact with people, in proximity, inhabiting these spaces. The woman who had the bleeding touches his robe. He is touching the lepers. There is an invasive way of Jesus' holiness in all aspects of our lives. Jesus goes towards the unclean, towards the isolated, towards the sick, towards the poor. His holiness transforms. It doesn't recoil. And so when holiness is invasive, that Jesus is not afraid of the messy parts of our lives, then when we can truly believe that, we don't have to fear the parts of our heart that are not healed yet. We don't have to hide. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to protect judgment on others in order to protect the illusion of our own purity. I see these people constantly on these social media apps that are trying to build this platform based on, and Christian people that are coming after LGBTQ people, coming after others in the church for not holding purity culture standards or not living that out. And I'm like, y'all, you need to look in your own lives, because this is really showing that there's something you are not looking at. I sadly am constantly waiting for the scandals, and the reality is they do come up. Queer people especially are often told that holiness means avoiding their desires entirely. Like, I work with queer people constantly who have been taught that they cannot trust their own desires at all. But holiness may actually mean letting God come closer to those desires, not running away from them, actually letting them be seen. That is the beauty of it, that it does not make Jesus run away. And so this is really crucial, especially for queer people, because queer people are often forced to pick a side because they can't have time to process. They need to decide what they believe and how they're going to live, and they need to live that out, and then you can't mess up. But queer people are often treated as dangerous if they admit that they're discerning, if they admit that they don't know. And this isn't just queer people, all of us. If you can't If you can't do that, if you are discerning, if you are dangerous because you're unsafe, you're unstable. And then queer people are seen as morally compromised if they fail to live their sexual ethic perfectly. Again, this kind of comes back to it was interesting to see people's reactions when I used the phrase pursuing celibacy. It gave people pause, and it was fascinating to watch it. But queer people are also rarely given room to grow, explore, wrestle, and change as Christians in every area. And I would say none of us are given that room within our sexuality. And then we wonder why porn use is so high among Christians, why divorce rates are so high among Christians, why affairs are so rampant, why we hold these standards, and then we wonder, are these standards even real? And personally, for me, the issue is not our standards. The issue is that we can't figure out how to pursue something without just suddenly forcing everyone to stop it and do it. I think that this is real in so many areas of our life. The values of Jesus are crazy. Like when we look at the values that Jesus promotes, like loving your enemy. I mean, loving your enemy, I think, is another one that we sometimes do because it gets manipulated. But like, it is a ridiculous value that Jesus has of forgiveness and loving your enemy. And we either moralize it away or we weaponize it to get people in power, weaponize it to get others to just submit to them. So it's another one that's completely misused. But the reality is for me that it's another example where I can believe that this is true. Jesus is actually calling us to love our enemies. Jesus is actually calling us to pray for our enemies. Jesus is calling us to forgive. But that doesn't mean you suddenly get there. It is the reflection of your heart. It's the thing I'm having to go through of like, wow, I don't love this person. I would really love for awful things to happen to them. And I can admit that. And I can share about that. And I can also still hold this standard that there's growth for me. There's areas for me to continue building in. And we don't disciple people into shame and fear. We disciple them into clarity, into courage, and into dignity. Because God, we need dignity in our sexuality. It's just a really needed thing. So as I close up today, I want to give a few last thoughts. Things that have been coming up for me while traveling that I hope can maybe help. For those of you who are listening and who maybe feel like you're in process, maybe you're there. You're like, well, I am trying to figure this out. How do I hold to these convictions that I'm honestly like not good at living out? I want to first say you're allowed to be in process. You're allowed to not, you can hold morals and admit that you don't do them well. So you don't owe that anyone complete, access to that. You don't owe anyone all of the clarifications. But I do believe that we start that process of integrity when we can find people we can be honest with. And that the people who we can be honest with that are going to meet us with the realest compassion and the realest love to show us that what it means for God to love us before we loved God. That we can hold our values and grow towards those things while also having compassion towards ourselves in not actually living them out well. And that God can meet you in that process. But often I think that comes from being able to let others into that. And then also, as we can reflect on what holds us back from living out our values, living out the things that we see as the way of the greatest thriving in our life, in the vision of the church and the Christianity and our faith, wherever that is, that as we process that, we let go of the need to control others in it, which I think is one of the greatest reliefs that we can ever experience. One of the greatest reliefs of my life is when I was like, okay, I don't have to hold others to this standard. And that doesn't mean it's still not my value. And for those of you who are trying to figure out, like, if you're a pastor, if you're someone else who's trying to be like, I don't know how to do that. So then, like, do I just let people do whatever they want? Do I have to tell people that I don't agree with how they're living? That's always like one that comes up. You can hold convictions, you can hold values as invitations, not as weapons. Like, our values around sexuality shouldn't be guns that we're holding to people's heads, where you get eternal damnation in one hand, or you get rejection from your community in the other, just all of these aspects. But we can create space where messiness is safe, where people can come in and talk about how they're living and maybe not even hold our values and be like, cool, yeah. Because I think it's really important to resist the need to categorize or label someone prematurely. That is one of the greatest needs we need right now, is just to meet people where they're at and resist the need to categorize them. And we can do that by asking better questions. Where is God meeting you here? Rather than like, what's your position on such and such thing? We don't need to be putting people there. We can ask people, where is God meeting you in your sexuality, in your understanding of this? That's transformative. That is helpful. So those are like some, broader pieces that I've been thinking about as I go about this. This is an area that I'm constantly feeling tension in when I see these scandals that come up, when I see the way the church is handling sexuality, when I see the judgment of Christian leaders on social media. We're called to reflect on what in my heart is, propelling me towards desires and decisions and actions in my sexuality. We should be self-reflecting on those things to grow and to heal and to learn. But I do think the real crisis in Christian sexuality isn't that people are failing. It is that we refuse to make room for the messiness of real transformation. And instead we just love to judge people or just to let go of everything. I don't throw up my hands in fear that people are not living out some standard. But I am always throwing up my hands when I see how churches and leaders lead through this space. I appreciate you all listening to this. As I said, we're going to be, for the next few episodes throughout the rest of the year, I'm going to be coming back on and I'll give an introduction to a different talk that I did and sharing those with you. I'm really excited to hear what you think of those. And then I'm going to be starting season 2 in next year as I talk to more guests and get on more topics. And I'm just so thankful for you all joining on this journey. Please continue to listen and subscribe wherever you listen. Give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and share what you would like to hear more about. So you can also follow my Substack, which you can go to holyourselves.org to subscribe there, or on Substack as well. I put out a newsletter every month. You can also support on Patreon. Like I said earlier, there's monthly bonus episodes where I share on more topics, as well as quarterly interviews, as well as you can help me figure out who I should interview and what topics and what questions to ask in interviews. And also, you can read some drafts of things that I'm working on, news resources and stuff, depending on the different tiers. So come join over there. And as always, thank you to Transient Friends for the theme song. I always love it, and it's always just a humbling gratitude I have in my heart for it being this theme song of Holy Ourselves. And thank you for joining me today. May you go into this week remembering that you are seen and loved and invited to live from a place of wholeness. And until next time, keep becoming.